All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of The Truth About Your Health, where our mission is to empower 100 million exhausted and burnt out men and women by teaching them the truth about their health so that they can go from exhausted to energized. And no more is the truth about health exemplified in the works of our next guest, who it is a pleasure and honor for him to be here today and give us information about how to get your energy back. His name, of course, I'm sure you all have heard of him, is Morley Robbins. He is the creator of the Root Cause Protocol and the Magnesium Advocacy Group. He received his BA in biology from Denison University in Ohio and holds an MBA from George Washington University in healthcare administration. And he's been training wellness coaches, nutritional counseling, and functional diagnostic nutrition, but most importantly, has a really what I feel is a groundbreaking, sacred cow tipping book on how to go about curing your fatigue. So without further ado, Morley, thank you so much for being here today.
Joel, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And I'm sure this is going to be a conversation that will be long remembered. I think it's just our phone conversations have been scintillating, and I'm sure this will be no less than what we've had in the past.
Well, I appreciate you being here, and it's always great to fill in the gray areas when I'm on my own path of understanding the information and, like yourself, wanting to make a difference in people's lives. And I know your mission is to refine, redirect, and redesign health so people that are suffering can ultimately get answers. And by having conversations like these and telling the truth and exposing it and having the courage, and I would say to you, thank you so much for your work, because a lot of people don't have the instincts or the wherewithal, or even, I guess, the gusto to want to prove that. And interestingly enough, just to kind of go into your background for people that don't know your story, you were in health administration for many years, which seems kind of antithesis to what you do now. So maybe explain to the viewer, before we get into how much you've researched and where you have arrived at, and the genesis of your book, and outlining the actual content of the book, which is our goal in this 3-part series, to really go through each chapter and help the listener who's exhausted and burnt out get energy back. Start with your story as how does someone who might be interpreted as being on the other team or on the other side of the fence, how do they get into this side? What was the journey, or what were some of the pivotal moments, Morley, in your healthcare journey?
Great question. I'll give people a quick thumbnail sketch. Grew up in a very sickly family. My mom was an alcoholic. My dad was manic depressive with schizophrenia, and that's a tough household to come into. A lot of illness, and my sister, who just recently passed, by the way, on the evening of Thanksgiving. God bless her, and she's in a better place. But she had her own health struggles for many decades, and by the grace of God, knock on wood, I seem to have circumvented a lot of that. But my sister was a nurse, so I was supposed to be the doctor, right? And then I get to college. It's like, whoa, this is hard. There's a lot of work involved, and I didn't do well in college. In fact, what gives it away for the real fine detail, I got a BA in biology. That means I didn't have the academic horsepower to get a BS. That's an important clue for people. I'm sure if people saw my college transcript, they'd say, how does this guy know how to spell iron, much less talk about it? But in any event, there is a plan. And if you don't get into medical school, which I didn't, obviously, and as Ben Edwards, physician down in Lubbock, Texas, says, actually, Morley, it's a blessing you didn't get indoctrinated. Because it allowed me to be a free thinker, approach it a little bit differently. But I decided to go into business and to become a hospital executive and then a consultant. And like you said, I was working on the other side for many years. But I knew something wasn't right. What I was really good at, I was really good at forecasting. You give me some data, and man, I could tell you where it's going. And through a series of projects, I began to forecast the incidence of chronic disease. This was back in the late 80s, and then again in it was probably 2000. It's just, Joel, it was frightening what was happening to the incidence of disease. So I decided I couldn't stay on the sidelines anymore, and decided I was going to be a wellness coach, whatever that meant. And I had spent 20 years as a consultant pulling a suitcase behind my back, going through airports. I was going from coast to coast, solving problems, helping hospitals get bigger and better and better. And but finally, my body said, "We're done," and I couldn't lift my hand above my waist. My shoulder was frozen. As a chiropractor, you understand that dynamic. And I was encouraged to go see Dr. Liz, and I said, "Hey, I don't do witchcraft." And they sold me some supplements. I came back a couple months later. I was miserable, couldn't sleep. I was in a lot of pain. And finally, the owner said, "Look, Morley, we love you. Go see Dr. Liz." Well, Dr. Liz is now my wife. And it was a transformational experience, because in 2 sessions, I had complete rotation. And I was like, what just happened? And Dr. Liz used a phrase that I'd never heard in 32 years of working in the hospital field: the innate healer. And I thought to myself, I didn't say anything to her. I thought to myself, if there's an innate healer, why do we have hundreds of thousands of doctors around the world? That didn't make sense to me. So I quietly set out to discover who is the innate healer. And that's really what the book is about. Cure Your Fatigue is letting people know that there really is an internal process that we all are endowed with if we have the right diet, if we're supplementing the right nutrients, and if we're not doing what, quote, they are telling us to do. It's a lot easier. And it's been a magical transformation. I never would have imagined 15 years ago someone saying, "Hey, Morley, when you're in your late 60s, you're going to publish a book on how to cure all disease." What? How to overcome all energy deficiency. And really what's really behind it, the nucleus. I think what you're really good at, Joel, is asking the critical questions to get at the essence of it. But the essence of what's behind the root cause protocol is, I want to democratize healing. I want everyone to have access to what Mother Nature intended that we would have all along, and that's to bring ourselves back into balance. And when we're able to produce energy optimally, and you understand what that's all about, and that's, you've got to have good adrenals, you got to have good thyroid function, but what you got to really have is, you got to have good minerals in order to drive the metabolic process to make that energy. And it's been an absolutely magical experience to build a Facebook following, and now publish a book, and then have a chance to talk with folks like yourself. And this is a pinch me, is this real moment. I've never had so much fun in my life. I've never worked so hard. Every day begins with 2 to 3 hours of research, starting out at 5 o'clock and trying to hit the ground running. But it's been a phenomenal experience, and I've been able to connect a lot of dots that's out there. And again, that goes back to my core strength, which is I'm really good at connecting dots, and that's really what's allowed me to have this, I guess, awareness of what happened and what we need to do to solve it.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing your personal background. There's a lot of commonalities that I can relate to, Morley. My mother was an alcoholic, and my family was traditionally trained medical doctors, and I'm the not real doctor. And as well as the fact, though, I would add on to, when we first talked on the phone to set this conversation up, we talked about having a good batting average, and really meaning, when you do get to the foundational, as everyone is looking to do with root cause, hey, I realize I want to get to the root cause. I want to get to upstream mechanics of not just putting a pill for the ill. And ultimately, when you do that, you have a higher batting average and you help more people, which I would imagine from what you've told me and what I know about you so far, that's probably more than anything, more rewarding than anything else, to really see the improvements of people and who get it, who've been frustrated and who've not been taken seriously, who've been marginalized, who've been even condescended and scoffed or laughed at, and they're the difficult people, when in reality, just like people, scientists that are forward thinking and are way ahead of their time, they're always criticized and condemned until eventually their being ahead of the curve catches up with everyone else. And so anyways, I want to thank you for that. And so with that being said, getting into your research, and I'll just kind of give the listener how I got into and came across your book, was my own health journey and understanding that I suffered with a stress related, overstimulated, can't focus, can't concentrate, anxiety, crashing in the middle of the day, circadian rhythm imbalance. And I had finished my undergraduate with exercise physiology. I finished an undergraduate in psychology. I finished the doctorate program in chiropractic. And here I was, Morley, probably over $250,000 in debt. My wife was pregnant with twins. She had to go on bed rest. We almost lost them.
Oh my
And
God.
I was tired. I was just graduated. I opened up a new business in another country. I a lot of debt. And here I was waiting for twins to be born. And I didn't realize that there was this term called adrenal fatigue. And I thought, oh my gosh, if there's this thing called adrenal fatigue, which basically has my picture as the picture boy of what it is, of what it described, only then to realize that it's not accepted, it's not a legitimate diagnosis, and going down the same rabbit holes that potentially you did when you heard the word healer. I kept refining and refining and refining to understand that it goes so much deeper than the adrenals, the HPA axis, as it works as a system. And ultimately, I tell people, as you well know, cells become tissues, become organs, become systems. And if your system is not making enough energy, because that's really what it's about, as we talked about earlier, by definition, fatigue means you don't have enough energy. Then something must be happening, not just at the system level, where medicine is very reductionistic and symptom treating and pharmaceutically approached, but at the cellular level, where we're just not making energy effectively. So why don't we start with, if that's what you arrived at 12 years ago and started going through the research, and you've written this book in terms of cure with the CU with a square around it. Why don't we kind of start from that, and at the cellular level, what's actually happening for us to not have energy effectively?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great place to start. Again, everything on the planet hinges on energy, right? You know, I spent a number of years in business. Well, there's a famous saying in business: nothing happens until a sale is made. Nothing. You gotta sell something in order to have a business, right? Because you gotta sell something to have revenue. Well, nothing happens in the cell until energy is made. It's the exact same concept. And you know, I did the training with Jerry Tennant, who's a classically trained MD down in Dallas, Texas, ophthalmologist. He's the guy that actually perfected laser surgery. But in his system, and he was wiped out for about 7 or 8 years. And he ended up having to reinvent his metabolism. He had to do research and get back to the basics. And he said, if I can get one cell to work, I can get them all to work. And that really inspired me. And so I got into really studying where does energy come from, particularly they're called purple bacteria. They go way back in time, back to the beginning of oxygen on the planet. And that's a whole nother discussion. When you take red and blue, you get purple. And so it turns chemical transition. There's what's called inside the mitochondria are basically three basic steps. You've got glycolysis. You have what's called the electron transport chain, where you've got four complexes, but they're called respiratory complexes. This is where the breathing really takes place. The respiration with oxygen is really taking place. Most important being complex 4, which we'll talk about. And when it's attached to the ETC, the electron transport chain, that then becomes what's called oxidative phosphorylation. That's a what? What's he talking about? But all we're doing is we are making sure that we're making ATP. And there's a very specific process that the mitochondria go through to allow that to happen. And the mitochondria have a little pool in the center. It's called the matrix pool. Well, the leading scientists referred to it as the copper matrix pool. Paul Colbine at Auburn University, the guy who figured out in 2004, there's 50,000 atoms of copper in that pool inside the mitochondria. It's like, wow. And then you begin to understand these electrical transactions that are taking place, well, they're copper dependent. And then we come to complex 4. That's the one where oxygen, it's actually being held by a heme protein. It's fascinating, like a catcher's mitt, to load it up with electrons, water. It's like, whoa, that's actions on planet Earth. Because what most people don't realize, we breathe, well, we can't live without it, but we can't age without it either. And so that oxygen, it's the second most reactive element on the planet. After fluorine gas, or fluoride, we know it as, but after fluorine, oxygen's second most reactive element. And it needs to be managed very carefully. And there's only one element on planet Earth that does that. It's called copper. Copper takes that oxygen, turns it into water. Copper takes what are called reactive oxygen species, which are given off in the process of making energy. It neutralizes them. It makes them okay to be with. Copper also, this is the most important for people to realize that in the sea of insanity that we find ourselves in post-COVID, not a lot of people are talking about the immune system. Well, I've got 52 articles that demonstrate and prove that copper runs our immune system, because the immune system is based on intelligence. Got to recognize what's out there, got to mobilize a response. And intelligence, as you well know, is based on energy. If we're low energy, we just can't think right. Well, our immune system is energy dependent. It's copper dependent. And I've got articles from 2008 that prove that copper kills SARS-CoV-2. So it's just, again, all of that has been pushed aside. And the thing is, copper combats enemies. So it's amazing. It creates energy, clears exhaust, combats enemies. That's an incredible array of functions for one element that most people think are toxic. Most people, the meme that's running the planet, the medical side of things, is you're anemic and you're copper toxic. And that's not true at all. That in fact is the exact opposite, because we are all copper deserts, because we follow the Western diet. Most of us didn't know that they had suppressed copper in the soil, suppressed its presence in the plants and animals. Well, our tissue doesn't have it, and then we're taking medications that attack copper, and we can have that discussion at some point. But the thing is, we are copper deserts. Well, critical research from 1928 at the University of Wisconsin, Hart, Steenbach, Waddell, and Elvium, proved that if you deny copper to an animal, iron will accumulate in its liver. Well, that's a big deal. I mean, the liver, it's like command central inside our metabolism. And 500 enzymes depend on proper liver function. When you start loading it full of iron, it doesn't work the same way. And what does iron do? It suppresses copper function. And that's the work of Jamie Collins and his team down at University of Florida in Gainesville. Some amazing research that's being done about this dynamic between copper and iron. And people just need to blow up this idea that they're anemic, because there's two positions that I take, pretty strong positions. One, there is no disease. There is no medical disease. It doesn't exist. But there is stress-induced mineral dysregulation that causes metabolic dysfunction. And so adrenal fatigue, or hypothyroidism, or whatever terminology we want to use, those are just catchphrases to describe a set of symptoms that are all expressions of energy deficiency, because minerals are missing and energy can't be made. So there is no disease. And I'm pretty strident about that. But the second is, there is no iron deficiency anemia on this planet. Again, people are like, wait, no, that's the World Health Organization tells me that's the #1 nutrient deficiency on the planet. It's like, well, at this point, you should know better than to believe the WHO. But the thing is, the number one element on planet Earth, 36% of the Earth's composition, is iron. Iron is the master pro-oxidant on this planet. And what happens with iron interacting with oxygen? Well, we call it rust. We know what rust is. We know a rusty nail, rusty pipe, rusty car. Well, that rusting process takes place inside our body when we're not managing oxygen and iron. And guess who does that? There's only one element. We're back to copper again. And that's the part that basic foundational understanding of what mitochondria do has been lost to the ages. It's not taught in doctor school. I would gladly give you $100 every time you heard the word copper in chiropractic school. I bet I would be shocked if you had even heard it once. I could lose a lot of money if you went to the right school, though. But no, it's just, I think it's a term, and then get into the copper enzymes, and this is a whole parallel universe that I never knew existed. Even when I was a biology student, I don't ever remember studying minerals. That wasn't part of the formal education. And I tease doctors about their degree, their MD degree, but it stands for mineral denialist. And they don't know what minerals are. And I think the other glaring challenge that we have is, and I'm sure you bump up against this all the time in your work, in your practice, is that the world has been trained to think in hormones, but hormones don't run the body. They really don't. It's amazing. Every hormone that exists is made from an enzyme. And 100% of the enzymes inside our body require a mineral catalyst to make it work. These hormones don't say, well, I want to make some more myself. It's incredible. Where are these critical reactions taking place? Inside mitochondria. It's like, oh my gosh, and we're back to critical minerals like magnesium and copper. And who's the bad guy? Iron. And nothing will kill the adrenals faster than too much iron in the diet. And you know that as well as I do. So I think people have been misdirected. And so we've been taught to focus on hormones, and we've been taught to focus on the nucleus. Well, that's where all the defects are. And there's this big body of knowledge about how we create energy and what the meticulous steps are that has been kind of pushed aside, so that people aren't aware of the real engine that drives our energetic process. It's been a phenomenal process of discovery over the last 11 years.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much that you said there and so many different ways that we could go, Morley, with that. And one of the very first things that I think of is in what you do. I think it's either in your introduction or somewhere near the beginning of the book, where if a doctor has a patient that comes in and they can't help them or haven't been able to help them, and they try something on their own and they come back and tell you, hey, I've had a lot of success with this, there's kind of a two-part response that could happen is the, well, continue doing that and I don't want to know anything about it.
Right.
Or I want to know about it because I took an oath to help people. And so I have that mentality of, if I don't know something, I'm not insecure and say, well, I don't want to know about it, or I don't have the holier than thou, it's wrong and I'm right. Besides which, the evidence and the research is so substantiated that you can't argue it. And these are universal laws, and it comes down to what we've learned in terms of energy production. And it begs you to look in the mirror as a provider and say, hey, like, maybe I don't know everything that I could possibly know. Maybe even, in fact, I've been making recommendations that have, although I wanted to help this person, wasn't the best recommendation at the time. And so you learn and you understand. And so that's kind of how I got on to, again, copper. And I noticed with a lot of the clients that I work, and like you said, I do a lot of six sort of standard deviations in terms of, hey, let's look at all of these different aspects, and ultimately led me to, why do most people that I have challenges with have a iron challenge genetically and a copper challenge genetically, and they're exhausted and tired? There's got to be something there. And there is something there, and it makes sense to the concept of what you say. And ultimately, having iron not get out of tissues is a sacred cow that you're addressing, in terms of, just because you're iron dysregulated, or if you have low iron in your blood, doesn't mean you have low iron in your body. And you could store up to 10 times more iron in your tissues than you can in your blood. So anyways, as far as one of the things that I would kind of defer back to now is, though, in the organization of your book, you use two words called misled and misfed. And I guess the segue to that would be, why don't we know about what you just told us? Why do we not look at energy production from a science like we learn in high school? Because that's really, even though, like you said before we got on the call, the old way it was educated with the one cell, one mitochondria, it's the power plant, and that's evolved so much further. The question is, why don't we know this? And what do the words misled and misfed have to do with that?
Yeah, great direction. There's no money in a cure. I mean, it's a very simple, there's no money in dead people. There's no money in healthy people, right? So there's a lot of money in people being less than healthy. So here's a really sharp example of what led to this idea of misled and misfed. There's a very famous physician named Paul Ehrlich. He was fascinated by immunology as a med student in Germany. He graduated in 1888, to give you a sense of his time frame. He wins the Nobel Prize in 1908. It's amazing to think what he was able to assemble in 20 short years. But in 1892, 4 years after he graduates from medical school, he uses something called methylene blue. It's an industrial dye, but he uses methylene blue to cure people of malaria. Now, this This dye had been developed and invented in 1876 at BASF Industries in Germany. And when they caught wind that Ehrlich had done this, they said, good on you, Dr. Ehrlich. We're going to make it better. So again, he uses methylene blue to cure malaria. It's gone. So BASF refines it and turns methylene blue into hydroxychloroquine. And now, if you get malaria in the modern age, you're treated, not cured, you're treated with hydroxychloroquine for the rest of your life. That's the difference between 1892 and 2021. We live in a very different world. And we have been misled about where the focus of the opportunity is. Let's call it what it is. If the goal is to get well, if the goal is to stay in balance, if the goal is to generate energy, you got to be really careful what your sources are, because there's a lot of misinformation on the internet. And it's not that people are necessarily malevolent. It's just they don't know. They're parroting back what they learned. But when you go into the source documents, again, a very important conversation I had a number of years ago was, don't focus on what's new, focus on what's enduring. That's really what got me back to the research of 1910, 1920, 1930. And it's a different world than the modern era. So we have been misled about the contemporary research is basically paid advertisement. I mean, it's just people don't realize the moneyed interest behind the research. I think they have a better understanding of it today. But the misfed is, there's just been massive changes in the world of agriculture, in the world of food processing. Something as simple as NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Farmers have been using that for over 100 years. Well, guess what it does? It blocks the uptake of copper by the plant. Well, then we go into the modern era with glyphosate, Roundup. There's no more perfect copper chelator on the planet than Roundup. It'll chelate copper down to a pH of 1. And who taught me that? Stephanie Seneff at a breakfast meeting back in Chicago 3 years ago. It was an arresting conversation to get her insights about this ubiquitous farming chemical that's used everywhere, all over the planet, and people don't realize what the cost is. So we are being misfed, both in terms of what we're being told is the problem, but misfed in terms of the quality of the nutrition that we're exposed to it's a far cry from what our ancestors knew. And it's, at the end of the day, we should be eating food that's real. And it's not real anymore. And you know that as well as I do. And it's a challenge for people to kind of come to terms with that, oh my gosh, my favorite whatever meal is not helping me. And it's just getting people to wake up to the cold, hard reality that we've got to put a lot of effort into making sure we know where our food is coming from. Do we know the source? Have we actually spoken to the source? Do you know the farmers that are providing your food? It's not an easy task to do that, but go to farmers markets or find, if you go to Whole Foods, identify what the farm is that's producing that particular food. Call them up, find out what they're doing to feed the soil. What are they doing to feed the animals? And get a sense of what's going on. And is that more work? You better believe it is. But you're going to have a lot more control over what's actually going inside your body so that you have a sense of certainty about what you're doing to ensure your good health. So misled and misfed just, I don't know, it came to me before a presentation, and it has served me well over the years because it helps people crystallize where the problems started and how they keep enduring on a day-by-day basis.
Yeah, again, there's a lot that you said there. And the first thing that comes to my mind is later in the book, which we'll probably talk about in the next time we talk, but just to reference it in terms of Weston A. Price and how his goal, or he went across the world and looked at indigenous countries or indigenous people and found that they had immaculate arches and teeth development. And this was because they had amazing soils and amazing foods that were replete with nutrients and minerals, and also had healthy fats and lots of copper, obviously, and animals and all of the things in between. I went on to research a little bit after that, and they're up until I think the 40s or 50s in the curriculum of the dental school was nutrition.
Oh, yeah.
And then up until a certain point, it kind of comes to a crossroads of, does preventative suggestions keep us in business? Right. And now you sort of are greeted with a smile and a lollipop after, as a child with a dentist, right? Because after all, they're bad guys, and they gotta, give you a needle or pull a tooth. So here's a lollipop, wink, wink. But at the same time, that's what keeps them in business. And why, unfortunately, do we have to get rid of a curriculum that would prevent the problem? And I think that's a microcosm of what you just said, right? In terms of being misled and misfed. And yeah.
Absolutely. People don't, Hal Huggins is a famous dentist that people may have heard of. Did a lot of work with mercury and things like that. Well, he actually inherited Dr. Price's research on root canals. And I was actually at a conference where he was there. He was present. I actually got a chance to shake his hand and thank him for his work. But people don't realize that the level of I guess dysregulation that can start with the dental visit. And in fact, I think Dr. Huggins wrote his book, It's All in Your Head, because what he figured out was about 80% of the physical problems that people have start with a visit to their dentist. And they don't realize it. They're not thinking about that, that tooth that needs to be pulled or filled or whatever. It can lead to all sorts of mineral loss and mineral dysregulation, and then energy loss. And it's just, and of course, back to Jerry Tennant, every one of these teeth of ours is connected to some organ system, thanks to the traditional Chinese medicine. And so there's a very tight connection between our organ health and our teeth health, and they're communicating with each other. It's absolutely amazing, as you well know. And it's just getting people to realize that there's more to the story. It isn't this programmed response, if this, then that. Well, that's just a narrative, and there's so much more to the story. And it's actually far more simple than people realize, but it's also enormous in its significance. So it's just getting people to recognize that.
Yeah, and just to finalize that dental profession, another mentor that I did a lot of research and followed his work was a doctor named Dr. Robert Marshall, and he talked about that there's probably no greater profession that created more harm to our health than the dental profession, because number one, the fluoride most reactive element on the planet, but then mercury on top of that. And then, but anyways, that's just a side note. So as far as the next topic, I guess we would talk about is the fact that, okay, well, I can accept that idea that the body makes energy. And that's ultimately what I teach people as well, Morley, is like, fundamentally, think of it very easily. Like you said, when you think about it easily, you have a demand and supply problem, and you're not producing energy at the demand that your body needs. And as a result, it's going to make decisions based on the available income that it has. And which we'll get into later too, which I want just to make sure you're aware of this question coming up, is nothing happens until you have a sale. And until you have a sale, then you're in business. However, with that being said, as we get into the actual root cause protocols, the majority of your emphasis is on decreasing overhead, right? And not increasing income,
I
right? You
love
know,
that.
if you
That's
think
great.
about it, right?
Yeah, that's
Right. So that's your
that's
main
great.
emphasis too. So that there's a lot to be said with that in terms of you want to make sure you get enough income coming in to meet demand, but you also want to make sure, I tell people, hey, as your business consultant to your body, it's much easier to lower your overhead and reduce the expenses of the things that you're using up valuable energy for, that you automatically are ahead. A penny earned is a penny saved, or penny saved is a penny earned. So I think that's really important for sure. But here's the thing, let's kind of talk about the free radical aging theory with oxidation, and quite simply how, because there's a couple of things I want to ask you as an adjunct to that question, but let's just start with that theory in terms of the free radical theory of aging. You're either, quite simply, like you said, combining hydrogen and oxygen to produce water or ATP, or you're not. It's
Right.
that simple. You're either producing energy effectively while at the same time reducing exhaust and inflammation, or you're not, or you're producing inflammation and exhaust and not amount of energy. And I tell people the analogy is like, imagine you working for me for a week, and at the end of the week, instead of me giving you a paycheck, you have the luxury of paying to work for me. And it's a double negative, right? On the one hand, you should be earning an income. On the other hand, you're paying an expense. And in this case, because you're not creating energy, you're creating inflammation. It's actually costing you money for that process while you're not making the energy. So anyways, why don't we get into the free radical theory of aging and explain what that has to do with the root cause protocol?
Absolutely. And I think it's, I love the overhead analogy. I love that. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. People need to understand that the mitochondria, it's a two-stroke engine. That the complex 4 that's so important, its formal name is called cytochrome C oxidase, and that's where oxygen gets turned into water. Very, very important transaction, as we're recognizing. But when you get into that complex, it is a two-stroke engine. There's many different steps in it, but the downstroke is to create hydrogen peroxide. So it turns oxygen into hydrogen peroxide. And then the upstroke is to turn that hydrogen peroxide, H2O2, into 2 molecules of H2O. And that requires energy to do that. And if there isn't copper to do that heavy lifting, it doesn't happen. Now, what is hydrogen peroxide? It's another way of saying inflammation. Inflammation is just a dysregulated mitochondria that's making H2O2, and it's not making 2 molecules of H2O. So people need to know where that inflammation is coming from. And so the key is making sure that people realize that this mechanism is that basic, that in terms of making sure that we're following through, that we're producing the energy that we need to. And so the key is bringing that process forward for our entire body. It's like it's kind of fascinating to think about the magnitude of it. And the essence is making sure that there is copper in our diet, and that we are able to make that conversion on a consistent and efficient basis in the body, throughout the body, throughout the tissue and the cellular structures. So the focus, though, and let's come back to your specific question. You really wanted to drill into the exact, what was the real target of
So
your?
it was more the free radical age theory. Yeah, right.
Right, thank you. So free radical theory of aging comes by way of a very famous physician. His name was Denham Harmon. Denham Harmon was actually he was an industrial engineer. He was studying oxidative stress in the industrial setting, and he had a PhD. And he decided, I wonder if these concepts that are so prevalent in the industrial setting, I wonder if they apply to humans. He decides to become a doctor, Well, he doesn't just go to medical school, he goes to Stanford. It's like, oh my God. And in 1956, he publishes this article on the free radical theory of aging. What was very controversial, this idea, because what it introduced, this is a real important part for people to understand, that up until that time, all disease was booga wooga bad. It was outside your body. It was invading, and it was you needed to be under threat and under attack. And what Denham Harmon exposed was actually we're producing the free radicals inside us in the process of making energy, and that's destabilizing our homeostasis. Well, that was a very heretical thing to propose, and it was hotly debated, as you can imagine. But in 1969, a very important breakthrough took place at Duke University, and Joe McCord and his faculty advisor, Erwin Fridovich, who just recently passed away, just last year actually, Dr. Fridovich passed away, famous research physiologist, but they discovered a very important enzyme called Super Oxide Dismutase, SOD. And there's 3 different forms of them, but the one that they found was called SOD Roman 1. It's got 2 atoms of copper, 1 atom of zinc. Zinc is structural, copper is catalytic. There's a difference between catalytic and structure. And when they brought that research forward, suddenly there was confirmation of what Dr. Harmon had been talking about in 1956. Well, then on the heels of that research, Dr. Harmon published an article in 1972 on the free radical theory inside the mitochondria, which was, he's building momentum. And then what's amazing is that in his 90th year of living on the planet, in 2006, he does an update of his free radical theory of aging. And these are just phenomenal articles to read. But what it does is it really presents a powerful premise for what happens in the process of aging and what happens to set the stage for symptoms. Because from cradle to grave, we're accumulating certain minerals and we're losing other minerals. Well, what are we accumulating? Well, we're accumulating calcium and iron as we age. What are we losing? We're losing magnesium and copper as we age. Where's the crisscross? Around the age of 40. What's a indicative sign that we've got mineral dysregulation? We have to go to the eye doctor to get our either get glasses or get them upgraded. You talk to people, when did you get those glasses? It's usually around the age of 40 when it kicks in. And so with the eyes go, therefore there go the body. But the thing is, especially guys, we're magnets for iron from cradle to grave. We have an enormous capacity to take on iron. Why do women outlive men? 2 reasons. One, they're smarter, and they have a monthly blood loss for 40 years. And that dumping of iron is what allows them to not be exposed to so much oxidative stress. And what is oxidative stress? We're back into the mitochondria. The iron and the oxygen are not being regulated properly. And what's a very important premise for people to understand is that the mitochondria is the terminal destination for iron and oxygen. And if they're not regulated and managed there properly, if the oxygen is not being turned into water, and if the iron is not being recycled into heme groups or iron sulfur clusters inside our mitochondria by copper-directed enzymes, if that's not happening, then we are going to build rust. And then we've got the start of metabolic dysfunction. It's a fancy phrase, or that's a fancy phrase for energy deficiency, as you noted. And as the energy deficiency builds, it becomes more and more symptomatic. And so it's important for people to realize that this idea of free radicals, and again, I just think the terminology is phenomenal. Free radicals. Hey, have as many as you want. They're free, right? Free. What the world of science is filled with these quirky little phrases. Free radicals. What they should be saying is, these are incredibly toxic chemicals. They're very reactive inside our body, and they're meant to be regulated by enzymes that have copper batteries. But that's the part that no one knows about. And so people may know about oxidative stress. There's actually 3 stages to oxidative stress. It's a continuum. It's a spectrum disorder, if you will. Oxidative stress starts out as hypoxia, builds into what's called inflammation, and then its terminal destination is something called cytotoxicity. Well, cytotoxicity is just a fancy way of saying cancer, and inflammation is just a funny way of saying hydrogen peroxide. Well, what's the problem at the very beginning? Again, we've been taught to believe that hypoxia means lack of oxygen. No, we're not at Mount Everest. The only time we're at Mount Everest is when we're inside our mother's womb. The amount of oxygen there is very tiny. That's a topic for another discussion. But hypoxia is really lack of bioavailable copper to flip oxygen into water. And if it can't do that, you're going to make what's called super oxide. That's an oxygen molecule with an attitude. It's got an extra electron, gives it a real big punch, and then the superoxide is going to be turned into hydrogen peroxide. So again, those are the classic. They're also called oxides. So you've got oxidative stress, oxidants, free radicals. They all are referring to the same chemicals, and they're all supposed to be regulated inside the mitochondria and ultimately inside the cell, so they don't become too exhaustive. Get it? Exhaustive. And so people need to recognize that when we're eating the right diet, when we're taking the right nutrients, when we are stopping the wrong nutrients, which we'll get into, I'm sure, in subsequent conversation, that our body has a natural ability to regulate itself. And we've been trained, again, back to misled, misfed, we've been trained like circus bears to believe that our bodies are powerless and that we must go to the priest to get some synthetic chemical to bring our body back into balance. And it's like, no, that's just not true. Absolutely not true.
Yeah, and following that up is if you equal or remove the disparity between demand and supply, and you're producing enough energy to meet the demands, your body knows what to do with it. And so I guess elaborating on what we talked about earlier, Morley, before we got started, was the microchip of the mitochondria, and how I really believe, as you've mentioned with that microchip, how important it is to regulate the programs that are being run by the computer. And there's no more sophisticated computer than our human body. And what I think should also be elucidated is the fact that we should have it when we have oxidants or accidents with oxygen radicals happening, we should have, it does help us. Not all radicals are bad per se. Like if we have hydrogen peroxide being able to be spilled off from cellular respiration, it communicates with your immune system to attack pathogens effectively. And that's where we regulate homeostasis. But the problem is that copper is deficient, so it's not there to regulate that microchip effectively. And then you have that continuum just kind of become an avalanche that rolls downhill and gets bigger and bigger and bigger and doesn't get turned off, ultimately creating a mixture of that hydrogen peroxide with iron, which creates the never good, no purpose whatsoever hydroxyl radical, which is getting a little bit into the weeds. But what is actually happening for denim to call it aging? Like why like those free radicals, if they're not contained? And, you and I have talked about Bob Miller, and Bob Miller is a 6 decimal point or a standard deviation guy. But one of the sayings I really love by his is, we've learned everything that we could learn as effectively in Goldilocks and the Three Bears, with not too little, not too much, but just right. So what is it about that? I mean, you don't want to take antioxidants to the cows come home so you don't have any exhaust, because that regulates your immune system, provided copper is available to turn it off, turn it on, signal, coordinate, do everything that it needs to do with it. But then at the same time, once that iron does get trapped in tissues because of lack of bioavailable copper, and that doesn't get dealt with effectively and too much exhaust is happening, now you have these nasty hydroxyl radicals. What happens for that to cause aging? What is actually going on there?
That's a great question. I mean, the aging process, or aging itself, is just another way of saying iron accumulation. I mean, there's a lot of research about that. I mean, the work of Douglas Kell, or Gutterich and Hollowell, or Robert Crichton in the Netherlands. I mean, there's some big names that have been studying this, and they're the ones who came up with this idea that we accumulate 1 milligram of iron every day we're on the planet. Well, folks, get your calculator out, put in your age, multiply it times 365, and you're going to get a big number. It's going to be 5 digits. And under ideal circumstances, women should have 4,000 milligrams of iron, and guys should have 5,000. Men can hold more iron. We have more testosterone, which allows us to handle that iron. But we live in an iron-enriched world. Everything is fortified with iron and calcium and vitamin D. And people are not stopping to think about, well, wait a minute, what happened to copper and magnesium and retinol? Why are we talking about those three? And all we're worried about is iron and calcium and vitamin D. And it's like, it's out of balance. Everything, I mean, the problem is we really are designed for homeostasis. And here's a really powerful image for people to get in their mind. I'm sure many of your listeners have been on a boogie board where it's got that ball in the center, and you've got to use energy in your legs to stay in balance, right? And if you're on the board and you've got your energy going, everything's fine. You stay in balance. The minute you release the energy, it's going to go one way or the other. That's when people are sick. That's when they have, quote, dis-ease. They're either here or they're there. But when they're healthy, they're in balance. They're in homeostasis. And that requires energy. And that's why the energy deficiency is so endemic. It's the signal event. It's the very first event to start the aging process and the so-called disease process. It all starts with energy deficiency. That's the work of Douglas Wallace, famous geneticist at Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania. And just to really build this image for people so they understand what's going on, let's go back to our high school biology class. Let's open up the textbook to see a picture of the cell. And when we look at the picture of the cell, there might have been 1 or 2, maybe three mitochondria in there. Well, that's not how it works. You know, we actually have 40 quadrillion. That's 15 zeros, folks. We have 40 quadrillion mitochondria in our body. The average cell has 500. That's a lot of mitochondria per cell. Try to picture that. But the average liver cell is 2,000 mitochondria. Kidney cell, 4,000 mitochondria. Heart cell, 10,000. The mature egg in a woman's body, number of mitochondria, 600,000. Then we have neurons in our brain that are actually as long as my arm. So picture this, it's three feet long. They're 3 feet long, and they have 2 million mitochondria. Well, we can't even get our head around that. It's like, oh my gosh. And so we've got to appreciate that the presence of mitochondria in our body is vastly different than what we were trained to believe. But then we get to the terminology itself. If we take the classic work of, say, Dr. Kohlenbach, famous German, he was a physiologist, studied the mitochondria, he would call it an energy factory. That's we're back to the high school biology textbook. Well, then let's upgrade it. Brian Glancy at NIH. He's a very up and coming scientist, and he refers to the mitochondria as the power grid. That's a different image. We've got energy factory, we've got power grid, and the pictures in his articles are phenomenal. If you're not familiar with his work, Brian Glancy, 2015, 2017, 2019, amazing pictures in his work. Well, then I was reading an article just the other day by Beltowski, Beltowski, 2018, and it was talking about the mitochondria and something called the uncoupling protein. What made a very important reference to the fact that mitochondria are the energetic, metabolic, reduction oxidation, redox, and information signaling centers of the cell. Wow, that's a very different image. We've gone from energy factory to this very sentient part of our cell. And then yesterday I was reading an article by Dr. Ruiz from 2021, just a few months ago. And it's the role of copper in the mitochondria. And she used a phrase I'd never seen before. She referred to the mitochondria as biological microchips. Wow, wow. And so we you and I are graced to have computers that are working, thankfully, knock on wood. And the motherboard of our computers is running on silver. These machines of ours do not work. We can't have this conversation if we don't have enough silver in our motherboard. Well, it turns out the motherboard, our metabolic motherboard, runs on copper, and no one told us that. And so it's a very different understanding of all of it's connected. And there's actually a program that runs all these mitochondria. It's absolutely amazing. It's called AMPK. There's an actual that's the program that runs the microgrid or microchip of the cell, and it's in every mitochondria. And it's like there's an oh my gosh moment when you realize that there really is a metabolic program that's running our vitality, AMPK. Oh, and there's a bad guy program. It's called mTOR. And I know Bob Miller knows all about mTOR. He loves to talk about mTOR. And he's really gifted at talking about mTOR. Well, how do you activate mTOR? Iron. How do you activate AMPK? Copper. And so it's just, and these are the Cain and Abel forces in our body. And people don't realize that there is this primal tension between copper and iron. And it's absolutely phenomenal when you get into it. But you've got to step past the paradigm of conventional thinking. And you've got to, it's important to embrace that there's more to the story. And what I really appreciate, Joel, is to have this kind of conversation with someone like yourself who really do understand this, and you really do seek to bring this knowledge to your community. And I commend you for that, because it's so important for more people to realize that it is a very straightforward process. It's just we didn't have all the pieces of the puzzle. And what the book, Cure Your Fatigue does is it introduces new pieces of the puzzle. It's not the complete answer. I think it's a good reference point. It helps people understand where the challenges are. But what it's really meant to do is empower the public to begin to take control of their homeostasis so that they can regain their health. That's really what it's about.
Yeah, well, thank you for the nice words. Definitely, like you said, the democratization of healthcare and bringing the power back to the people, not just at the 30,000 view foot, but at the cellular level too. And ultimately, one of the things that I love that you mentioned earlier, that especially for people that look at the term adrenal fatigue, which has its own controversy, which Morley, I'm in the process of doing a report on the history of how that, while Hans Selye was sort of the father of stress research, he really did create and initiate the controversy associated with adrenal fatigue, because of the fact that in his 3 general adaptation theory, named his final stage the exhaustion stage. Well, in 1859, already a doctor named Addison came up with an idea of the fact that there's this thing that they actually thought it was first an adrenaline problem, because they didn't realize that at that time it had yet to be synthesized. But they thought it was the inner part of the adrenals that no longer, because the opposite of adrenaline is wasting and fatigue. So they thought it was an adrenaline problem, only to realize that it was the cortical problem, and it wasn't able to put out enough cortisol to meet a baseline amount. And so medicine already had its definition of what an exhaustion problem was, or an insufficiency problem was, and 1 in 100,000, whereas people read the internet and come up with a term called adrenal fatigue, when in reality, it's not in the peer-reviewed journals, it's not taught in the medicine and in medical schools, just like what we're talking about right now, and mineral balance and energy production is not taught. And then to your point, we're misled and misfed, and it becomes almost, the thing that really upsets me is the dogmatic holier than thou dismissal, and then the almighty profit of the dollar to keep it running. But anyways, one of the things I want to talk about, which is probably a good ending point, at least going through this theory, is I love this concept of, well, I still don't necessarily agree, if I'm just a listener, that it's this copper thing. I heard it's toxic. That's more of a problem than deficient. I am, like, I've had people, I'm sure you've had this, where their doctor has told them they're iron anemic, Morley, that they've had to take transfusions and they've had to do it. And what you're telling me is sacrosanct to what's going on. But what I love is, and you told me you almost felt like reincarnate in terms of being there in the room when Warburg, who basically research that was laughed at as cancer is a metabolic disease, and ultimately it can't be so easy that your cellular respiration is breaking down with the presence of oxygen. And you found, and his disciple Krebs, who both were scientists with Nobel Prize resumes, and are wanting to understand, how does energy get produced in the body? Like, how does it happen? And you found a paper, brought it back to life, and it really pointed to the importance of copper and more than iron. So why don't you kind of finish it off that way, and then we'll have a to be continued from here. Yeah,
that's great. And I had the pleasure of meeting with one of my research heroes, Jamie Collins, down at University of Florida. And he actually gave me a Nobel Prize. And it's like, pretty cool, right?
Yeah.
We're gonna ignore the fact that there's chocolate in the center, but
right.
but so we're dealing with two esteemed scientists, clinicians. These guys, we're talking about, Hans Adolf Krebs was his full name, and Otto Heinrich Warburg. So these are Germans. This is in pre-war Germany. We're in the late 1920s, and from 1926 to 1930, Krebs works for Warburg. Just the image of those two working together is just amazing to think about. And in 1927, they did an experiment with pigeons and geese, and they bled these birds almost to the point of death. And so what were they actually doing? They were creating a true state of anemia. There's very little blood. There's no iron now because the blood is outside of the animal. And they wanted to see what's the metabolic physiological response to that clearly stressful state for those birds. And what they discovered, much to their surprise, is that in the pigeons, there was a 3-fold increase in copper enzymes, and in the geese, a 6-fold increase in copper enzymes. Now, again, it's 1927. They won't discover ceruloplasmin and its ferroxidase enzyme function for 21 years. 1948 is when Holmberg and Laurel, Swedish physiologists, discovered this blue protein that it's the powerhouse of our body. But back in 1927, they knew what a copper enzyme was, and there was this whoop, and this huge influx in the geese. And what happened to that research? It gets pushed aside. Why? Because it clearly indicated that copper regulates iron. When you have a near total loss of iron and the body responds with copper enzymes, well, that tells us who's in charge. And in the world of homeopathy, copper is referred to as the general, and iron is referred to as the foot soldier. And what's really critical to understand is when we're talking about Dr. Warburg, this is a guy who got nominated for the non-chocolate form of this medal 47 times. 47 times. This guy, I don't think there's any other scientist on the planet who's had that kind of recognition. And he wins the Nobel Prize in 1931 for an enzyme that has the classification 1.9.3.1. Only reason why I remember that is 1931. And so Dr. Warburg got the Nobel because he's the one who identified this specific respiratory complex, complex 4, in the electron transport chain. But here's the catch. What did he call it? The German phrase was Atmungsferment, which means respiratory ferment, but he referred to it in English as iron oxidase and gave no homage to copper. And that threw off scientists for decades because they thought iron was running the mitochondria, when in fact, when you get into the bowels of the research, especially this Ruiz 2021, it's like, it's copper all over the place. And that's the basis of my research, is of my uncovering the research that I've uncovered, is that it's clearly a copper dependent mechanism on every level. And again, that just has not been, that truth has not been brought forward because there's no money in that level of understanding, because it puts the individual in control, which is really what we're seeking to do. But that may not be the interests of those who are at the top of the pecking order. So that's kind of the history behind it. And what Joel was referring to is that I have this sneaking suspicion, I believe in past lives. I have a feeling I was a technician off in the corner, saw what happened, and didn't do anything about it. And now in this lifetime, I'm like trying to get the word out. Come on, folks, it's not what you think it is. And it's actually almost a comical experience to have the level of insight I have now. You know, again, on the heels of my college career, and yet it feels at times like my microphone is about an inch high when what I need is an Empire State Building microphone, and I don't know if I'll ever get. But it's these types of conversations that are so invigorating, and the ripple effect is phenomenal, as you know. You don't know where these conversations are going to go. So it's always a delight to have this kind of repartee and you kind of respond to these really important questions so people have a completely different understanding about what's going on. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, well, no, I love hearing the stories. I could just imagine the rolling of the grave when he named it in a way that misled everyone. And then on top of that, the research got buried, and it's like, no, that's not what I meant at all. It reminds me of a story where I heard this story and it just kind of popped into my brain, where the little girl asked her mom, why do we cut off the little loaf of the meatloaf, you know? And if you heard this story before,
yeah, I love this story.
And I'll just leave it for the listener to understand. So I finished the thought, and she says, well, that's because grandma does that. And, you know, it's a family tradition. So I might be butchering it. So I apologize if I am.
You've got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, so, you know, grandma happened to be there, and the girl asked her grandma, why did we cut this off? And it's like, well, it's because your great grandmother did that. And lo and behold, the great grandmother was there too. And she asked the great grandmother, well, why did you cut the end of the meatloaf off? And she said, well, because we didn't have a big enough, cooking pan to put it in. And I think that's apropos in terms of what we're talking about and how we get misled and misfed, and intentionally too. And it's that sort of that glass house, or the first stone that's cast leads us to false truths. And as you put, is missing information is missing truths. And what we have now, as you have seen and mentioned, is almost, if you watch Seinfeld, the George Costanza approach to healthcare is do the exact opposite of what we've been told, and we'll probably do well, right? But on top of that, it's not only that, it's the fact that there's more than a pandemic of energy crisis. And even though and you allude to it a lot with food, and it's the small of savings, or my wife always says to me, the lazy man works twice as hard, right? If you would have just done the job in the beginning. And I think what's going to be happening is we have this pandemic of metabolic dysfunction, or tidal wave. Not even pandemic is a good word, because it's the reason why people do so poorly when they get exposed to a virus, and they're being told to do other things that are making their energy productions problems even worse, and more likely to do worse with that. But either way, what I'm trying to say is that we've been tripping over dollars to save pennies, and with the food and the processing and how much cheaper it is, ultimately going to have to pay the piper at some point, where you're going to have the bankrupting of our system because of all of these chronic illnesses that are coming our way, or are here already. But as much as I say, because Morley, I'm from Canada originally, and I say when you move to the US, it's the best of the best and the worst of the worst. And I really feel that's where we are with research. Is while this is daunting and overwhelming, and there's all the people that are suffering with exhaustion and fatigue, there really is a root cause protocol which is out there, which is not meant to be a cookie cutter program. It's meant to be massaged and basically customized, but it's very therapeutic and effective at producing energy and decreasing the demand and supply inequality, so that your body has the intelligence to do what it will with it. And I guess that's what we'll do with our next part. So I guess what I would ask you in passing is, well, let's say this has piqued people's interest that haven't heard of you, and it's amazing, and you offer really great information, whether it's the book itself or on your website, the actual protocols to do and start and begin. So where can a listener find that, Morley? And why don't you tell them a little bit about that?
Absolutely. For those that are on social media, there's a Facebook page and a Facebook group. There's a Facebook group called the Magnesium Advocacy Group. The Facebook page is the Root Cause Protocol. And there's a website, RCP for Root Cause Protocol, rcp123.org. And now there's a book. It's called Cure Your Fatigue. And again, it's play on words, as Joel noted. The CU is got a little box around it, so you recognize the symbol for copper. But Cure Your Fatigue, and you can get that on Amazon, Books, Barnes, all the platforms. You won't find it in your mom and pop bookstores yet. That's going to take a little bit of time, but it's doing well. This is a very healthy sales process to undertake. I'm really pleased with the receptivity that people have to the book. And it comes in a physical book and an ebook. And in the spring, there'll be an audio book available for people, because I know folks are always on the fly and they need other ways to get their information. And the other thing that people are, if they're at all piqued and kind of intrigued by this, we have a training program. It's a 16-week training program. It's called the RCP Institute. Again, you can Google that, and you can find it on that rcp123.org. And then for the critical few, there's always some that want to reach out personally. My email address, it's just my first and last name at Gmail. And for those really enterprising folks, my phone number is area code 847-922-8061. This is usually when the podcast host is like, "You gave out your cell phone number?" And I've done that for years because I figure it's better to make the information available. And people seem to have the self-regulating capacity to know when it's important to call or not. And I welcome calls and look forward to the conversation. So a lot of different ways to reach out. There are probably 100 podcasts, conversations like this out there. They're getting really exciting as more people are reading the book and really beginning to understand this. So I think there's no shortage of opportunities to hear me blah, blah, blah. And it's always fun to talk with people like Joel, who really gets it. I mean, it's like, I wish we had recorded the first 2 conversations we had. It was a blitzkrieg of information back and forth. And I genuinely appreciate the work that you've done to amass your understanding and look forward to our continued dialogue going forward, because I think we're going to uncover some fun nuances for people, especially I'm really loving overhead, too much overhead. I love that.
Oh, good. I'm glad to contribute something. I
Yeah,
think it's a
absolutely.
testament to you to make yourself available to anyone that wants a little more insight. And you're right, it's a self-selecting process. And ultimately for me, there's been little nuances that have really increased my understanding. So what we'll do is we'll keep it at the 1 standard deviation, but we'll maybe get a little bit more into the weeds, because a lot of the things that I look at as well get into the genomics. And it doesn't mean just because you have this gene SNP, it's a 1 gene SNP approach. It's a sort of a 3D chess game played underwater, even though I agree with you, Morley, in terms of it's a real tell for me now. I almost sort of kind of wish I didn't, sometimes you wish you don't know what you know now, but I'm past that point where I have tells when I know people tell me that they're taking ascorbic acid or vitamin D. There's all these tells now that I have where I like, okay, you're not on the wavelength of fundamentally producing energy at the level that you need to. Exactly. And it becomes, but with that being said, I do want to take it that next step level with our next conversation and get into what ceruloplasmin is, get into the importance of vitamin A. One of the things I'll tell you is the MBR, the magnesium burn rate, was a real game changer for me. We all know about how important magnesium. In fact, we underestimate not just the enzyme function, but the protein function, and how many more by 10 times more important in cellular energy production and running this show. That was a big game changer for me. So thank you so much, because those little nuances, in terms of the Pareto principle, 1 to 2 to 3% of the things you change get 97% of the results. And I've been seeing that firsthand. So thank you so much for that. But we'll do a to be continued. Everyone knows how to get in contact with you. And we'll be publishing this soon. And I look forward to part 2. So thank you so much for your time today, Morley.
You bet. Thanks so much for the chance to have this dialogue.